All right, we are going to go ahead and get started because I know there will be lots of questions and lots of great things shared. So welcome to the Traveling Owls Faculty Fireside Chat. I wanted to let you all know that we are using the webinar format of Zoom, which means your video and audio will remain muted throughout the entire session. However, I highly encourage you to use the Q&A function for any questions that you have for our panelists and the chat function to comment and connect with one another. My name is Shannon Burnett, and I am the Assistant Director in Alumni Relations responsible for the Traveling Owls program as well as Homecoming and Reunion Weekend. I've also invited the Associate Director of Alumni Programs, Kate Coley, to join us and help monitor the Q&A and chat features. Kate is the woman behind our Classroom Connect, Brains in a Bar, and the new Beyond the Hedges podcast, as well as a Rice alumna herself. So I'm very thankful that she's a part of tonight's program. And now the real reason that you guys are here are incredible and beloved faculty members. I could try to do their introductions myself, but I know I wouldn't do it justice, so they have kindly and graciously agreed to provide their own brief introduction before we get to the questions. While they're introducing themselves, though, I would love for you guys to let us know in the chat if you've been on a trip with any of these faculty members, and if so, where you went. We are going to go in alphabetical order by last name. So you guys can come off of mute. And Lisa, will you kick us off?
Hi. Yes, I'm Lisa Balabanlilar. I'm a professor in history. I work on India and Central Asian history. I'm now the chair of the new Transnational Asian Studies Department at Rice. And I've been on a lot of trips and they're great. So I can't wait to hear some of your questions and some of your stories.
Hi, I'm John Boles. I too am on in the history department, although I just retired as of July 1 after 40 years of teaching at Rice. I've been doing Rice trips since 1984. Have been on a lot of them, have loved the trips, loved the people, loved the experience, and hope I can keep doing it.
Hi, my name is Elias Bomba. I've been at Rice since 1995. I teach in the Department of Religion. I am chair of the department now, and I have been on several trips to Africa and loved it. Really been amazing getting to know more about Rice, actually from the perspective of the alumni. There's nothing as enriching as that experience.
I'm Scott Solomon. I'm in the Department of Biosciences. I've been at Rice for just about 11 years now. And I teach courses in introductory biology and ecology and evolutionary biology, as well as public science communication. I also teach through the Glasscock School, so I've interacted with some Rice alumni through that program and other community members. And I'm relatively new to the Traveling Owls program, but I got to participate in 2 trips last year, one to a trip along the Amazon River in Peru, which was phenomenal, and the other was in the Galapagos Islands, which were 2 places that are not only amazing destinations, but both near and dear to my heart, and both places that have been a big part of my academic career. I decided to become a biologist during an opportunity I had to get involved in research in the Galapagos Islands as an undergraduate, and just decided that there was no way I could do anything else with my life other than find a way to get back there again. And then the Amazon basin was actually the focus of my dissertation research, which looked at how biological diversity is generated in the Amazon. So getting to go back to those places with folks from the Rice community was just a unbelievably wonderful experience. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you all so much, and thank you for agreeing to be here tonight. We do have a few pre-submitted questions, and then hopefully our attendees will have some questions for you all. But if you guys have questions for one another, I welcome that as well. I'm glad to have this to be a dialogue or a little bit more of a conversation. I'm sure there's plenty of stories and perspectives and experiences that you can share. But I will get us started. And the first question I have is for all of y'all, and it's a two-parter. So first, let us know, maybe it's an estimate, how many Traveling Owls trips you've been on. And then two, what was your most memorable of those trips? Anyone can get us started.
Well, I'll start. My first trip was in 1984, and since I'm not sure, I would say at least 30 trips, and they've been uh, everything from Jefferson and Paris to the colonial South to up the Mississippi River. And trips I particularly enjoyed were Lewis and Clark trips. So it's hard to say which I like best. I mean, it's hard to do better than Jefferson and Paris, for example. On the other hand, the Lewis and Clark trips, you can go places where it's hard to believe it's in the United States. It's so isolated, and you can read from Lewis and Clark journals, and they're describing exactly what you see today. So it's almost uncanny that you can read someone talking in 1805, and their visual impression is precisely the same as yours. So we've camped out, we've hiked, we've been in snow, we've been in storms, just a lot of fun trips.
I started, I think, about 7 years ago with my first trip to Turkey with the Traveling Owls. I had lived in Turkey for years in the 80s. I don't think I've ever quite matched that first trip in terms of how we built a sense of family in the group of travelers. We spent 4 nights on a Gillette boat, sponge fishing boat off the Aegean coast. So every day we'd get off and see things, and every night we'd go back to the boat and become hilarious and drink and dance and sing and tell jokes and tell stories. And some of the people I met on that trip are still very dear friends. So that was extraordinary. Other than that, I'm thinking about what Scott was saying. A lot of the trips I've made match up with my academic research so tightly, and probably the highlights, 2 highlights, so many highlights. 2 major highlights: Uzbekistan in Central Asia, which was the homeland of the dynasty I actually do my research on. And it's a difficult place for a woman to travel alone. So going with a group of fabulous human beings was just extraordinary. And then my last trip was last summer to Mongolia, which has long been a dream. It was very difficult and just everything I needed it to be. Wonderful people to travel with, the owls, just wonderful.
Okay, I've been on 4 trips. My first trip was to Kenya. It was an amazing experience to see not only the landscape, but the people. And what touched me very much was the difficult balance that the people of all the areas that we travel were managing to continue conservation, yet be able to open all of these places for the many visitors that come. Some of the regions that we went to, like down in Samburu, was just amazing. Just there is forest all over. And you have people who live on very little, but to me, all the time we were there, it just seemed to me as they lived the most fulfilled lives. And having a conversation with them was like going back to a school and learn about the African customs, about the way they have survived over the years. And then I have been on trips in Southern Africa. I think our most memorable trip was when we went to Southern Africa in 2013. We had a great time in Soweto. I think for most members whom I have traveled They are very well read about these places, Southern Africa particularly. But to be in Soweto and actually see the contrast with what is a major city in the world and see life and the challenges of Soweto touch many of them. And they just interacted, just bonded with the children and had a wonderful time sharing. So much so that actually our drivers, when we got back into the car, they told us, you have been a very good group. We are going to add to your itinerary. We didn't know what it was. They decided on their own to drive us in, to take the buses and drive us in front of President Mandela's house. There were candles all over. It was just beginning to get dark. And they said, we cannot stop. But the president is in there. He is very ill. Pray for him. Then we went to the hotel that night. By the time we got back from the trip and I arrived in Houston, the next morning, Mr. Mandela died. But what was very important as I shared conversations with members of the team was that sound bite that was broadcast all around the world when Mandela says, I am not a saint, except if you mean it by a saint, a sinner who keeps trying. That soundbite was delivered here on the Rice campus when Mandela visited Rice University at the invitation of Secretary Baker. So I will never forget that trip. But
I want to take a trip with you, Elias. I want to go to Africa with you.
Yeah, that will be fun. That'll be fun. But very quickly, the thing to add also is the landscape of Africa is just amazing. I do not, a place like Namibia, you do not really know what will happen in the future. You can only hope that all national efforts and global efforts at conservation will yield fruit. The animals are wonderful, the pictures are wonderful. On this last trip, I think I finally became the official photographer because I took all of the pictures of the elusive animals that we couldn't get, and that was a lot of fun.
Well, that was a tough act to follow. Well, I've, as I mentioned, I've done 2 trips just last year, and they were both amazing. But I guess if I had to choose one as my favorite, the Galapagos Islands is just a place that is, to me, one of the most special in the world. I mean, I'm an evolutionary biologist by training, and so to get to walk literally in Darwin's footsteps, I mean, similar to, the way Dr. Boles was describing earlier about seeing a landscape and reading the journal entries by Lewis and Clark, it's actually quite similar in Galapagos with Darwin's descriptions of the islands. Most places, they've hardly changed. And so you've got that history, but then you've also got just, of course, this spectacular wildlife that you're getting to see that is unique. You've got the enormous tortoises, and they're walking around you. I mean, they're wild, and they're now, thankfully, they're quite abundant in places. Marine iguanas, just species that you don't see anywhere else in the world because they don't exist anywhere else in the world. But as if that weren't enough, those species have evolved in isolation away from humans and in an environment that doesn't have many predators. And so they've never evolved fear. And so one of the things that is just so special about Galapagos is that you can get right up close to the wildlife. In fact, you have to be careful not to step on the wildlife. You literally have to be afraid of stepping on or tripping over marine iguanas as you're walking around on the seashore, because they won't get out of your way. And so that's just, I mean, there's just nothing quite like having those in-person encounters. And the trip that I was on was focused in particular on wildlife photography, and they sent along some wildlife photographers, National Geographic photographers, who were there to help folks get better photos. And so just to be, up close, eye to eye with a marine iguana, and working with professional wildlife photographers to help you adjust the exposure and get the right angles and everything. That was just amazing. But then to reiterate what others have said about getting to do this in the company of interesting people from different backgrounds that all share some sort of a rice experience is the icing on the cake. So that to me, even though I'd been to Galapagos a few times before, this was a trip for me that was like no other because of the way in which we were doing it and the people that we were sharing it with.
I think everybody, I've talked to people who've done these trips for years, and I think everybody says what we're all saying here, how one of the nicest things about the travel trips are the rice travelers, because they're smart and they're curious and they're interested, and they're all traveled a lot and they read, and they're also just so nice. And on many occasions, we've had the same experience that Elias talked about, where the guides have said to us, you are so much better than the last trip we had. You people are so much nicer than the last people we had. And that's been our experience. We like Lisa, we have friends that we made in 1984 that we still see and still talk to and so forth. And it's such a fun experience to be seeing beautiful scenery or strange scenery or exotic scenery and hearing music and seeing architecture and so forth, and then having good meals, and then having really lively conversation of people who are not bored, but are excited about what they're seeing. As a matter of fact, in all these trips, only once have we had one traveler who was cranky and irritable and complaining and fussed. And actually what happened is he embarrassed everybody on the trip. And the people on our fellow travelers took this person aside and sort of, said, straighten up, you're embarrassing us. This person was so hateful, he made two of our tour guides cry. So we had to really kind of straighten him out, and he got straightened out, and it was much nicer after that. But that's the only time in 35 or so trips involving hundreds of people that any one of our people was rude or unpleasant. And I think, given how often one meets rudeness and unpleasantness in life, that says a lot about the quality of the travelers. And that's one of the things that I think that makes the experience so much fun. Not only are you going to interesting places and beautiful places and exotic places, but you're doing it with a group of people who really know how to appreciate travel. And I would say appreciate life. And that just makes the whole experience infinitely better.
If I can just add one more thing to what John is saying, I'm always struck the trips we have done to Southern Africa. When we get to Victoria Falls, all the members of the team are looking forward to a special moment with the kids at the school. They bring supplies, some bring monetary gifts and so on and so forth. And so we go to this little school and the children perform for us. We talk, the members of the team play with the kids and so on and so forth. It's a very interesting way of connecting with the locals. This last time, that was 2019 when we were there. We were all taken by surprise because the long dictator had been ousted out of power. And even the teachers at the school were joking now that they can now talk openly after so many years, and let us into the kind of local political issues which in the past they wouldn't have. I think coming back to a place like the United States, sometimes it makes you appreciate certain things when we complain. I mean, the teachers themselves, they just opened up. There was just an air of liberation, so to speak. The children were dancing, and it was amazing. The previous visit, everybody was very careful what they said. They said the official line, but this time all bets were off, and they were very free to express themselves. It touched me a lot.
What Scott said about those animals in the Galapagos not being afraid because they haven't had predators, this is something that always intrigued me about some of the journals of Lewis and Clark. they talk about seeing on the high plains herds of antelope and so forth in the tens of thousands, and also herds of buffalo into the tens of thousands that were so tame and so docile that they could hardly walk through them. And they would sometimes have to take a stick to kind of punch and, to get the buffalo out of their way. It's odd though, because Indians were in that region, and the Indians were obviously hunting the buffalo for their hides and for their meat. So it's always surprised me that, given the fact that the buffalo were aware of being hunted by Indians, that they were still so tame that Lewis and Clark had to kind of shove their way through the crowds.
We do have a few questions that have already popped through, but I'm going to ask one more before we get to those. And I think our attendees, and I know myself, would be curious into what exactly your role looks like on a trip. When you go as a faculty member or a RICE leader, what does that look like? And how do you prepare for that? Is there anything special you do? Anyone or one can answer.
Well, I give a series of set lectures that I prepare ahead of time. Generally, it's related to my research and my teaching and my previous travels. But once I'm on the trip with the group, I admit I become a little bit more of a fellow traveler. I don't tend to do a lot of impromptu lecturing, although I have been known to circumambulate a few tombs and visit special gardens along the way. But it's just so lovely to have this mixed role of kind of friend and companion, but also knowledgeable, a knowledgeable companion who can share some of the background and the context to help everybody better understand. It's a pretty congenial kind of setting. So I don't think any of us see ourselves as being like lecturers on these trips.
Well, people seem to want me to do that. I got maybe pressed into that. I tend to, some of the earlier trips, I would give a sort of a formal lecture here in Houston before we went on the trip. But normally on the trips, I have at least 3 blocks of time set apart, like for 45 minutes or an hour, for what I would call more or less formal lecture. I mean, my formal lecture is not very formal, but I mean, they are typically formal. And then I do a good bit of talking. For example, often we have to take buses to take 30 minutes here and 20 minutes there and so forth to see particular sites. And I often fill up the time on those buses, either explaining in advance or elaborating on or trying to give context to what they are about to see or what they have seen. So I actually do quite a bit of talking. And I don't know, I guess people do it different ways, but I mean, I travel, but I do a lot of talking. And I think people expect that. I guess people have different expectations. But several times when the tour people had their own lecturers, people have kind of fussed and complained that they don't want those people to talk, they want me to talk. That's embarrassing to me because those people are on the trip and they're hired and that's their job, and I don't want to get in their way. So I try to be really careful, even when tour guides are saying things that I know that are wrong. I don't correct them. I wait till we're back on the bus and then I say, I know that person said so and so, but that's not right. I can't stand to hear people saying incorrect things. But I never quarrel with them or correct them or whatever in person. I do it when they're out of the way.
I think I have had similar experiences. What I usually do is I do sometimes 3-4 lectures. I tend to look at the list of the people who are going, and then my lectures are going to be on the kinds of things I do research and teach here at Rice. But I also then, if I have looked at the background, like this past trip, there were a lot of people who were physicians and in the healthcare business. So one lecture, for instance, was dedicated to what religious communities have done in the long struggle for HIV/AIDS and so forth. and bring about the international dimensions of it. And we spent quite a bit of time actually talking, for instance, about the president's initiative on HIV/AIDS and malaria. And this is President George Bush. And they found that actually very helpful, that we could make those connections. And the LGBTQ issues are very tough in Africa. And so we had colleagues traveling with us who were members of that community. And I had prepared a broad overview of what the issues are, what the challenges are, what the difficulties are, and basically expressing my perspective that it comes down to how we treat a fellow human being. And yeah, I mean, I was very, not that it would have surprised me from Rice alums. I mean, they received that very well. So sometimes I can speak to a specific issue, especially if that is a very tough thing that is part of the conversation going on in African communities and so forth. But generally, they are background, religion, politics, culture, society. Two of the trips, the tour guides were really very well informed, but I think the 2013, I had to do what John was just saying, just really sit back and try not to overcorrect, because at some point it seemed as if there was a competition between him and myself and so forth. So it was very careful balancing. But the last one that I went, I actually got to a point where I really wanted the tour guide to speak, because he was extremely knowledgeable, and he would talk. And I mean, a Jewish South African who knew the country and the region very, very well. And then that way I was able to adjust and restrict my lectures to more formal academic issues, because I knew he was giving us really, I mean, he was very polite. At some point he will ask me, is that correct, Elias? And then of course I would tell him, actually, you know that better than I do. And it worked quite well.
The only thing I would add to what's already been said, I mean, I give a few formal lectures too, but I tried to also sort of serve as a sort of organizer for getting the group together from time to time, and try to organize some small group interactions, try to make a point of getting to know each of the participants individually by having some one-on-one conversations with them, taking some group photos and fun stuff like that too. So it's just nice to have a sort of a way to have some more formal get-togethers, and then also just some more informal gatherings within the group from Rice.
Yeah, I was, and Nancy and my wife, we always travel together. We've done a lot of these trips, done a lot of the trips, a lot of the people we traveled with before. So, there is in some sense, there's a desire to have your meals with the people you already know and the people you're friends with. But we always make a very concerted effort to have a meal with every single traveler, because we just, something about, I think, sharing a meal and talking to people, you get to know them better. And that's a large part of the trip, is the kind of the human interaction. So we sometimes people kind of want to sit with you, and we have to sometimes say, no, we're trying to have dinner with every single person. We've already had 2 dinners with you, so we really are sorry, but we've got to meet with these people. So that's a really, really concerted effort that we do every trip, is to have at least one meal with everybody traveling.
Well, one more thing I have found is that they actually, the people that travel actually love and care about Rice. They ask me tons of questions, and sometimes it would even be things about buildings all kinds of developments. This last time I was very fortunate that Albert Kidd and his wife were on the trip, and so he helped a lot in answering some of those questions. I mean, Albert has been on the board and knows a lot about the infrastructure at Rice. It amazes me that among all of the travelers, there is just a really keen interest in knowing almost what is going on back on the Rice campus. I found that fascinating. Sometimes, I didn't have all the answers, but we've had a good time talking. And then, of course, they share a lot about that time. They remember a lot of their famous professors, professors, the ones that they thought were just outstanding, the ones who were very tough to take classes with, and yeah.
Awesome. Well, we will get back to my questions maybe later, but there are already a couple in the Q&A, so I'm going to kick it over to Kate to get some of your questions answered.
Yeah, so this one is kind of in the vein of what y'all were just talking about a little, but are there any classes in the GLS program that you're teaching that will have an upcoming trip aligned with the class, or have y'all done that in the past?
Yeah, I taught a class on Mongolian history before my trip to Mongolia, which was really fun. A few people were in the class that were on the trip, so that made it really rich. I'm teaching a class on early Islam. Actually, it's not so early because I do bring it to the 20th century this semester in the Glasgow School. So that's not directly related to any specific trip, but since most of the trips I take are in the Islamic world, it's all kind of interconnected. It's a lot of fun to teach a class and work a trip into that package.
I also taught a course prior to the Galapagos trip that was about Darwin and evolution. There didn't end up being anybody that took the course that then went on the trip, but it was fun for me to get mentally prepared for being in Galapagos, and I think that there were a number of people in the course that became interested in the traveling owls trips. Maybe we'll sign up for one in the future. So yeah, that was a fun way to kind of whet your appetite for a great trip.
Yeah, I taught a lot of continuing studies classes on different aspects of Jefferson or in colonial history or whatever, Southern history. And I'm teaching a class this fall at the Women's Institute on Jefferson. But in some ways, for example, I started doing the Lewis and Clark trips and doing the research on Lewis and Clark trips before I actually wrote a biography of Jefferson. And similarly, I was asked to do a trip of Jefferson in France before I wrote my biography. And so I did a lot in preparing for my trips and visiting the places that he wrote about and saw. It was kind of the other way around. My trips informed what I wrote and taught rather than the other way around. But normally I only do trips that are in regions or on topics of something I already know a lot about. So I don't have to, I don't think of a trip I've never been to and then spend 6 months studying up on it. I don't choose to do a trip unless I'm already kind of ready to go. I've never been to Spain, and so I've talked a lot of times about wanting to do a trip to Spain. And of course, I haven't done that. And several people have suggested that I ought to propose a trip entitled, instead of doing my trip called Jefferson in France, which I've done 3 or 4 times, I should do a trip called Jefferson in Spain. Now, actually, Jefferson never went to Spain, but who would know? I could say that, and that would get the trip to go. And then, I could kind of imagine how he would have experienced it. So I thought that might be a kind of an interesting way of doing a trip, is to kind of imagine how someone you know something a good bit about, how they would respond to the kind of things that you're seeing. So far, I haven't been bold enough to suggest doing such a trip. And somebody might actually raise the question, when did he go? But,
John, this is very interesting. I'm teaching a class this semester for undergraduates on the history of travel and travelers. And one of the topics or the themes within the class is imaginary travelers or travelers who lied.
Yeah.
People like John Mandeville in the medieval period, who pretended to have gone on this massive journey and wrote about it, but it was entirely made up.
Right.
So you could do that, John. You could be the new John Mandeville. Travelers who lied. Perfect.
I think the only course that I do at Rice, and the last 3 or 4 years it has been taught by my graduate students, is religion and politics in Africa. And that comes very handy when you are in the Southern African region, because of course Christianity was used to dominate the populations there, but it is also the rise of radical Christian theology, which builds the revolution, which ends in reconciliation and so forth. So some of the materials that I use for that class, we talk about it. So it's not only a conversation about Mandela, it's a conversation about people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, what motivated them, the kinds of African churches, why the churches that started as African indigenous churches didn't participate very much in politics and so on and so forth. So in fact, some of the things that I say in those presentations come directly from some of the lectures I have prepared.
Yeah. Well, my undergraduate classes on the history of the South were the whole backbone of all the trips I took to Charleston, Savannah, and so forth, those colonial South trips. Although those, of course, my classes had nothing to do with those trips, but the material that I talked about on those trips was material that came straight out of my class. So,
well, this is the point for all of us, isn't it? We're all scholars and specialists, and we get to draw from our academic experiences and bring it to a group of companions on an adventure and combine those roles. That's what makes it so exciting.
I mean, I'm in love with my topic, and I want to talk about my topic. And I want, whether they're undergraduates or graduate students or lay people or continuing studies or travelers. I mean, I like to talk about what I'm interested in. And so
I love listening to you.
Well, between my undergraduate class and my graduate seminar and travel trips.
I have to tell you, when I first invited to participate in a Traveling Owls trip, and my wife was asking, well, what are you going to do? What does this involve? And I said, well, I'm going to give some lectures to the fellow travelers and share what I know. And she just laughed. She's like, oh, twist your arm, right? Like you'd be giving lectures even if you were just another person on that trip.
Yeah.
So yeah, exactly, right? Try and stop us.
That's what unifies us.
We can't help ourselves. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But I think what really makes it a very touching experience is that all the participants actually listen and ask questions. And many of them are amazing readers. And sometimes during the question and answer period, then they're bringing materials and information that they have read from some place, and it makes for a very interesting discussion. What has always intrigued me is when we get to Southern Africa, they are intrigued by the story of David Livingstone, and then of course Cecil Rhodes, who lived in almost every country in that region, and all of the amazing things. You get to Victoria Falls, both the bridge and the falls itself bring these two individuals together, and almost, everyone on the trip knows something about these individuals. And I find the lectures either by local hosts very, very interesting, and the interaction is always very rich.
Y'all are making me want to go back to school with all of the talks of your classes. I'm just so fascinated. So speaking of the travelers being good readers, we have a question here. Just people wanting to travel again, but not sure when it can happen. Do y'all have a reading list? What would you recommend to read to kind of get that travel bug under control?
Ooh. Can it be brought under control? Is the
Absolutely
travel bug your vaccine for the travel bug? My list is too long. I'm happy to share. I can send people, but look, I'm teaching a class on this. My list is pages and pages. I'm happy to share some recommendations, but not here. It's too long.
Yeah. Same here. I can share some things that are very informative, but sometimes actually, I think it's good to actually just read fiction that is written by authors from that region of the world, because in the case of either East Africa or Southern Africa, you have the tour guides and myself who can give all of the intellectual background. But sometimes I think it's very good for people just to take a novel written by an African writer and just read the story. I think people will be very surprised what those novels have. It could be great conversation starters when they meet with people.
Yeah, always provide a reading
Go
list.
ahead, John.
They always provide a short reading list for my
Right.
classes too, for my trips, for 6 or 7. And sometimes people will read nothing, and some will read everything, and some will ask for more. But I hope after the trip that they want to go and read a lot more after the trip. So that's my goal, is that more of their reading is when they get home rather than before they go.
Yeah,
A lot of recommendations would be driven by specific locations and cultures.
Right.
Exactly.
So, general recommendations for travel. Ooh, that's tough.
Yeah, I was just going to say, for instance, most Americans know Alan Paton's classic work, "Cry the Beloved Country."
Yeah.
But if someone is going on that trip, it would be good to read something like Angie Krog's book, "Country of My Skull," which actually was made into a movie. I can't remember the name of the movie now, but in addition to the academic things, I think it would be novels and things like general writing from the region alongside with the academic things would be very helpful.
I don't have too much to add. I mean, I agree that it's hard to generalize. It depends on the trip. I think it is fun to throw yourself into a region and into in some cases an era or a discipline prior to the trip. But I also agree that it's one of the best things about travel is that you then see those disciplines and you see those places and you understand those people in such a new way that you just can't get out of just the experience of reading. And so it's just as fun, if not more, and more satisfying perhaps, to go back and read those same things or read something else after having been to that place and experienced the trip.
So this is also one that might be tough to answer. What is the top of your bucket list for a trip? And maybe you've already been on it, maybe you want to go on it, but just what is that for you?
That's so not hard. I've hit all of the places that I needed to get to because of these trips. But I want to return to Uzbekistan. That was one of the best places I've been. And I just can't wait to get back to Turkey. That's kind of the home of my heart. And as soon as it's safe, I'll go. I do have a trip, more bucket list, right? There were some sacred sites in northern India that I had long wanted to see. And we finally planned a trip for that for this next March. And we've shifted it. Shannon, when is it? It's in March of 2022 now, right? Just to make sure that we don't have to keep moving it around. That's a bucket list trip for me. We're hitting pilgrimage sites and sacred sites for maybe 5 major religions. It's just an extraordinary trip. We'll get to the Golden Temple in Amritsar of the Sikhs. We'll go to Varanasi to the cremation ghats. we'll go to Gandhi's ashram in Gujarat, everything. So, okay, so it wasn't an easy question after all. The bucket list continues.
But I also like going back to places I've been. For example, I've done this Jefferson and France trip 3 times, and we're doing it again. I'd be willing to go to Paris every year, you know. And each of these trips we tweak it a little bit, so you see something different. Or they've restored a cathedral and it looks different, you know. So I just like that trip, and we've done a lot of trips along the colonial South, the colonial Virginia and so forth, from Mount Vernon to Monticello to Williamsburg to Jamestown. And the architecture and the history and the culture and the ecology are so interesting. And for those people, we know so much that you can talk about those people and those events and those issues and those crises with a degree of texture that's hard to imagine. So I like getting into those kind of details. But again, there are places that, you know, you never get tired of places like London. And I mean, I haven't been to the Asian places you've been. I have been to Turkey, and I would love to go back to Turkey, but my bucket list doesn't keep getting longer, except Spain. But I do just like going back to the same trips and experiencing the same trips with different people and different weather and different climate and different seasons. The same place can be so different at different times.
I think for me, probably something in the area of North Africa, but that is something that will take a good conversation. But I've also been thinking of Ethiopia, and the thing with Ethiopia is that there is a lot of ancient history there, and if it is planned very well, I think it can be able to incorporate these small historic towns that have both not only the African material, but the religious material like early Judaism, Islam, Christianity. But I think the most fascinating place will be 2 places there. Gondar, where there is an early palace from the 11th century that still stands. And then, of course, Lalibela, the historic rock churches. I think people would really like to see that, and to see that these are actual houses of worship, which, you know, no stone was moved to the location. Everything was hewn out of the massive rock, both the doors and windows. But I think to make it work, if they are out there in Ethiopia, which is probably one of the best hubs for transportation in Africa, they might as well, you know, make a safari trip to either Kenya or Tanzania. I think a combination of a trip like that would make one that includes Ethiopia very appealing.
Elias, it's so funny you said that, because my wife and I were very fortunate to get to spend a week in Ethiopia. And it was actually sort of an unexpected trip after having spent some time in Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania doing safaris. And we had the opportunity to spend a layover in Ethiopia and started looking into what there is to do and see. And we were just absolutely blown away. It actually ended up being our favorite part of the entire trip. So exactly what you were saying. So Lalibela just blew my mind, and was one of the most incredible places I've ever been. I guess for me, my bucket list is sort of revolves around wild places and wildlife in particular. And I've been lucky to get to see a lot of those places, but the places and species that top my bucket list would be, first of all, the island of Borneo, and an opportunity to have a close experience with orangutans in the wild. I was lucky to get to come face to face with mountain gorillas in Uganda, and it was life altering. Just to be able to be face to face with a wild gorilla, one of our closest living relatives, and see them in the wild, just was, I've never been the same. And I would love to try to have a similar experience with orangutans. Another would be an opportunity to see blue whales in the wild. Blue whales are not only the largest current living species, they're the largest species that has ever lived, larger than any dinosaur. And the best place to see them today is in the Sea of Cortez, Baja Peninsula in Mexico. So that is way up on my bucket list, but probably the top of the list would be Antarctica. It's just in terms of wild places, it is the most wild place on the planet today. And it's obviously so hard to get to that it's just, not a place that, most people ever get to see. Personally, all my research travel has involved looking for ants, and it's the only place on Earth where there are no native ants. So I've just never had an excuse to get to go. So that's way up at the top of my bucket list.
I see Andrew Lynn has a question about any domestic locations, and most people have been to these places, but I think that every American, particularly if you live in a flat place like Houston, that you owe it yourself to go to places like Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, the Grand Tetons, Glacier National Park. I think the topography in those places is just unbelievably stunning. And I also think that there are a lot of really interesting places in terms of history and architecture and so forth that you don't have to go to other continents. I mean, I think you could go to Virginia, for example, and Colonial Williamsburg and Jamestown and Yorktown and some of those houses and so forth. I think we just sometimes forget that there are things close by that we may have heard about or saw when we were 12 that really repay visiting much later when you know more and travel more and you appreciate them more. So, I mean, you don't have to spend the tens of thousands of dollars to go to truly exotic places. There are a lot of really wonderful things to see that are really quite convenient and quite easy.
If I could add to that, sorry.
No, I'm just agreeing. Go for it, Scott.
I was just going to agree as well, but and add that to me, I've had been lucky to see a lot of beautiful places, but I think southern Utah and northern Arizona, you mentioned the Grand Canyon. For me, I think that part of the United States, per square foot or square mile or however you want to measure it, has to have the most spectacular concentration of wild landscapes anywhere, and certainly anywhere that I've seen.
Yeah, I love that area too.
Yeah, I mean, there's like 5 different national parks just within, a short drive from one another if you include.
And they're also different. They're very different,
exactly.
But they're close together.
Exactly, and fascinating geology, fascinating wildlife and natural history, and human history as well.
I have not looked at the West Africa region very well, but I'm not sure. I mean, but I think it's possible with the conversations going around the world now to find places along West Africa that can connect to a lot of American history. The west coast of Ghana, for instance, the slave castles, and Liberia, where the first freed people under the time of President James Monroe returned to Monrovia to start a new country, and then you can fly further to the west coast to Senegal, which is probably one of the most famous of all of those places where slave ships departed Gorée Island. And I haven't looked into that very much, if such a trip could be sold, but it is a possibility that something like that could attract a certain group of people who are interested in that history.
There is one more question in here that I think it's a quick one for you, Scott, on your trip to the Galapagos. And Sydney was asking if you took the northern route, southern route, or all around.
It wasn't really any particular part of the islands that we focused on. We visited, I think, 6 or 7 of the islands, including the Western Islands, which that was new to me. So in Galapagos, the Western Islands are not only the largest, they're also the most geologically active. So they have volcanoes that still erupt, and they have the highest concentrations of wildlife, including possibilities of seeing big whales. We had my wife was with me on the trip. We had an enormous manta ray pass right underneath our kayak at one point as we were moving along. It was unreal. And we had the opportunity to actually see marine iguanas feeding on algae underwater while we were snorkeling, which for me was just nothing else like it. So we didn't hit the northernmost islands, which are a bit more remote and have also big concentrations of large marine animals like schools of hammerhead sharks. We didn't get to that area, but we saw just an incredible amount of things on that trip.
Awesome. If you are tuning in for trivia on Thursday, I do have a question about the diversity of the Galapagos Islands climate. So that's a little teaser for you. You want to do a little pre-research. Unfortunately, our time has come to an end. And I think one of my biggest takeaways from this is that we need to do it again. An hour is not long enough. I have several other questions I wanted to ask you guys, and maybe I will on the side. But I will definitely be reaching out. I also took mental notes on the locations that you wanted to visit. So if I reach out, I hope that there's a yes already in there. I do want to thank all of you guys for giving your time, your stories, your experiences. The Traveling Owls program is so lucky to have each of you guys. I also want to thank Kate for helping us with this delightful conversation and monitoring the chat and making sure we get to all those Q&A questions. And then I want to thank all of you guys for spending your evening with us. I do want to remind you guys that the Destination Debut events are not over yet. Like I mentioned, on Thursday at 4 p.m. Central Time, we do have our travel trivia happy hour. That will be using the Zoom meeting function, so I'll get to see all of your faces. And I have some travel trivia for you, but also it'll be an opportunity for you guys to share some of your Traveling Owls experiences. And next week, each of our 11 tour operators will be hosting a webinar for their specific 2021 Traveling Owls trips. So if you are interested in any of those trips in our catalog or on our upcoming trips page, I highly encourage that. If you're unable to make them, we will be recording them and then sending them out via email to everyone. So don't worry, you'll get the information. The links to all of those were sent yesterday afternoon to all of you guys who registered, and then a reminder email will be sent on Friday with the links to those tour operator webinars and the schedule. If you don't get the email, if you don't get the links, please email travelingowls@rice.edu. If you have additional questions, please also email me at travelingowls@rice.edu. I have one final request, and that's at the end of this meeting, there will be a brief survey. It should take no longer than 5 minutes for you guys to complete, as that will be very helpful in us planning future things, although I already know this one's happening again. Thank you again to our faculty, Kate, and to all of you. I hope to see you at Traveling Owls events soon. Bye.